It's a tale old as time. Narrative is the vehicle that connects us to something greater. And for Christian Beckwith, he's built a career on that foundation. You probably know of Christian, or have interacted with his work. He's spent more than 30 years immersed in the world of alpinism, and in that time, he was the editor of the American Alpine Journal, co-founded Alpinist, which Reinhold Messner once called the greatest climbing magazine in the world, and recently started a hardcore history podcast about the 10th Mountain Division called Ninety-Pound Rucksack. Now, if you haven't heard that, you might be living under a rock. But since this is a climbing podcast, that's, pretty much a valid excuse. So, touche. In any case, it's great, and I highly encourage you to give it a listen. In this episode, we don't actually talk much about the podcast. Instead, we hone in on how to complicate seemingly simple projects by going deep, clues to find the narrative in anything you do, and what can happen when you follow your curiosity. I'm grateful for Christian for coming on as our last guest of season 1, and big thanks to our sponsor who supported us all season, Blue Ice. Thank you. You know the drill. A quick word from them before the interview. Blue Ice is the best kind of ice, and also my choice when it comes to fast and light ice climbing gear. The aerolites go in like hot knife through butter, and their climbing packs hit the sweet spot between function and lightweight. Designed to get to the point in the Alpine, their gear is tested by mountain professionals between the Alps and the Wasatch. If you're looking to get to the point too, and with a little less weight in your kit, check out Blue Ice's gear at blueice.com or your favorite local retailer. Where are you in your process with, are you doing seasons, and then where are you in sort of the book development and things like that?
I am Alice falling down the rabbit hole.
Sure.
I can't see the entrance anymore, but I also have no idea where the floor is. So honestly, I just have been, this is the first time I've ever tried to do a podcast, and I think I'm just approaching it as I approach all sort of narrative projects, and that means I'm flying by the seat of my pants and making it up as I go along. And I honestly don't know. This has already taken so many twists and turns that it's difficult to envision how or where or when it will end. I know what I've envisioned, and I think I'm still on track to do that. And that's to use the podcast it's my real-time research for the book. It's also my real-time education at a very deep level in the history of the 10th. But then it's just taking these twists and turns. Like last week, we pulled off the 90-pound rucksack challenge. So who saw that one coming? Had that in 3 different places around the country. And then I went the next morning down to Camp Hale and ended up plugging in with the 10th. And we did this recreation of a traverse that they had done in March 1944 as part of the D series, the division series. And we went from Hale to Vale. So Camp Hale at 9,200 feet all the way over to Vale Resorts. And then the next day was this great convening at Ski Cooper, where we just had folks from all different elements of the Army. The Colorado National Guard was there, the 10th was there, and it was a tribute to the 10th's original contributions during World War II. We had 300 people skiing down Ski Cooper in tandem in uniform, and I found myself in between 2 generals on the way down. Who knows where it's all going? I really don't have a good sense of. I know where it began, and I know I'm in the middle somewhere, but I have no idea where it's going to end.
Yeah, that messy middle will mess you up. Do you ever do simple projects?
No.
Just what a sigh.
I wish I did. I just was flashing back to the last few things that I got involved with. And we just came back from a hut trip up to Canada where I ended up winning I won the lottery to the Bill Putnam hut. And so Bill Putnam was part of the 10th. He was part of the American Alpine Club. He wrote a book called Green Cognac on his time with the 10th Mountain Division. So going up there was like a double whammy of goodness. You got to go skiing, and I also got to kind of lean into his post-war legacy. I ended up organizing it, and it was just like, oh my God, this thing is so many kittens to herd, and just trying to coordinate the guides and the cook. And that's about as simple a project as I organize. So, yeah, I'm not very good at simple.
So somehow we have another New Englander on the podcast. I am from New England, and I intentionally scheduled quite a few, but then there have been several surprises, and both you and Taylor were coincidentally from Vermont, which is to say that you don't seem to maybe identify as a New Englander. You're mostly known for your time in the Tetons in Jackson. I'm curious how you ended up there.
Well, that's a good question. Again, I'm not very good at simple answers. I grew up on the coast of Maine, actually. I'm a redneck farmer from mid-coast Maine.
My mistake. Sorry
And
about that.
yeah, quite all right. I somehow got off the farm. Like nobody where I grew up leaves where I grew up. I think 12% of our graduating class went on to some form of higher education. 80% of that was military. So folks tended to stay right where they were. But my childhood best friend had an exchange student from New Zealand who showed up at his house for a year, and it just boggled my mind because I just started reading The Hobbit, and that really put this whole idea of adventure into my mind. And here was this fellow coming from what sounded like, Middle Earth, and I started thinking about doing it myself. So I ended up becoming an exchange student in Italy for a year right after high school. And then I got back and went to University of Vermont. And when I was there, my junior year, I was an English major. I ended up becoming part of something called the Buckham Overseas Scholar Program. And in England, I went to school at the University of Kent at Canterbury. And they had the Brits are just so organized. They have all these clubs. And I remember there was a woman from South Africa who I had a fancy for. And she first was going on a club outing to a caving destination in Wales. So I said, sure, I'll do that. And then caving just is, I really didn't see the draw. It was a bunch of astrophysicists for some reason. They were so into the underground. But then she said a couple of weekends later, the climbing club is going to Wales for a climbing trip. I said, okay, I'll try that. And the second I think my first climb was called Milestone Buttress out of Llanberis, Wales. It's a multi-pitch, and I just did not know what I was doing. And there was another woman with me that she didn't know what she was doing, and we had a guy who was leading us up. I'm sure it's like, 5'2" or something, but it just boggled my mind and blew my whole imagination sideways. And I was like, oh my God, this is the wildest thing I've ever conceived of doing. And that was the hook. I mean, I was just like, oh my God, this is so phenomenal. I went back to Maine, and after graduation, I started selling Christmas trees. I could make enough money for a whole year, which was like $3,500. And I ended up going to, I think I went to Joshua Tree my first trip, and then ended up in Asia, hitchhiking around, then ended up in Alaska. And then the second year, I wanted to go, I'd heard about Waco Tanks, Texas, so I went bouldering for a winter. While I was there, everybody stayed in the Quonset hut, Pete's Quonset hut. I don't even know if it's still there. And there were all these magazines scattered around on the Quonset hut floor. And I remember picking up an old Rock and Ice, and it was actually a 2-part series by Paul Gagne, who might be familiar to some folks, about alpine rock climbing in the Tetons. And I was like, whoa, alpine, what is that? That sounds cool. That sounds like something out of Middle Earth. I want to check that out. And so I hitched up to Jackson, and as I was getting about 40 or 50 miles out, I just started feeling something that I'll never forget. I've spent a lot of time wondering what the hell it was since. I think it was just the sense of coming home. And I remember coming into the valley, and it was really, it was a very wet spring, so there was a lot of fog. You really couldn't see very much. But as we came into Jackson's Hole proper, I just had this overwhelming sense of returning to a place that was home. And I really haven't left voluntarily since. I had to leave for American Alpine Journal for a couple of years, but I've been here for around 30 years now. And this place has just been, I don't know, in New England, I just felt claustrophobic. I think both the geography, the flora, just how the trees kind of they kind of block out the sky a little bit. And I mean, I grew up on a farm. I was outside my entire life. And I think I was in love with being outside. And we used to go skiing during the winters. And I was definitely way into skiing. And I loved the mountains. But I don't like skiing at ski areas in general. I don't like the mechanization. I feel like it gets in the way of a relationship with the surroundings. And so coming out here was just like, wow. I mean, it's wild. If America has one thing in abundance, it's wilderness. And Wyoming has that in triplicate. And coming here just felt like coming home.
I'm curious about what coming home felt like to you, and did Maine feel like home to you as well? Because the reason I ask is because I've done a fair amount of travel, and I'm always kind of looking for that place that maybe not just feels accepting, but like that I really want, that I feel gravitational like pull towards. Haven't yet. I like Slovenia, but probably not Slovenia. Sorry, Anna. But yeah, I guess like for you, it sounds like it was an immediate sort of magnetic attraction.
It really was. I think the Tetons are a power center, and there are a few power centers that I've been in. I think the Bears Ears area down in the Cedar Mesa area down in Utah, that's another power center. But there's what would you call it? Like a spiritual resonance here that operates on a frequency that's difficult to perceive with human senses, and yet right below the surface there it is. And it's got this hum is also a draw. I think that's what I experienced when I first came into this place. And it's interesting. I've been here 30 years now. I've traveled all over. There was a year when I went to, gosh, it was right when Trump got elected. Sorry for the politics, but I was like, I don't know if I can do this. So I ended up going to Chile. We went to Norway. We went to New Zealand. Went up to Canada. And the only place of those places, the only one that really resonated, on a maybe similar level was British Columbia, like Nelson area I just loved. But I keep coming back to this place, and now there is the draw, and that is sort of a constant. But then there's also the fact that we have, we've got a daughter, we've got a family, we've been here 30 years, we got all our friends. And so it's not just that the frequency that kind of roots me here, but it's also life itself. This is the island upon which we built our house. So here we are.
I'm also really impressed by how much development and investment you've personally made in the area, to just reading some of the past projects you've done, from, the bouldering project to your conservation nonprofit, things like that. And yeah, it seems like when you do something, you just really do it. Like you just keep building and building and building.
Yeah, sometimes I wish that I was motivated by money and I could put the same sort of effort into making making money, because I'm horrible at making money, but I'm good at doing absolutely ridiculous things that make no money whatsoever. And a lot of those are based around climbing. And that's sort of been fairly constant since I got here. And because of that early experience in England and in Wales, when I arrived, I was just absolutely gobsmacked, as the Brits say, by this place and its power and its people, the people that were drawn to this place. There's this incredible legacy of mountaineering, obviously, but then mountaineering is just a pursuit, right? It's the people that make it special. And there were the climbers who were the photographers and the storytellers and the artists. And they were so impressive, but there was no hub. Like there wasn't a central gathering spot. There wasn't anything that kind of brought them all together. I don't know why I did this, but I decided to start a club. We called it the Wayward Mountaineers. And this was just a function of what I'd seen in England, because the British club system is just so organized, and it really got me into climbing, and it got everybody at the school I was going to into climbing. I thought, well, shoot, we could do something like that here, and it would help people like me were just getting here for the first time and didn't know shit from Shinola, basically. And so we had 4 objectives, and the first one was to publish a magazine that captured the art and writing and photography of the climbers of Jackson Hole. And then we did something called Speaker Series. I was too ignorant to know that I shouldn't do this, but I would. Yvon Chouinard happens, he lives here and he was in the phone book. So I just called him and was like, hey, Yvon. He's like, oh, come on up to the house for dinner. So I got him to speak. I got Royal Robbins to speak, Paul Petzel to speak. It was just sort of this cast of characters. And I really, had no right inviting any of these people. I was enamored of the mountains, but also conscious of the fact that I knew so little that I would probably die if I continued to go into them without any sort of instruction. So we put together something called instructionals, and I just tapped into the guiding community here. We did things like peeps parties where we'd take our avalanche transceivers and try to figure out, how to navigate a potential avalanche scenario with our transceivers. We did snow schools. We brought in this just crazy cat named Dave Carman, who made the first alpine style ascent of Cerro Torre, did the first winter ascent of the North Ridge of the Grand. Phenomenal rock climber, just as graceful as a ballerina. And he taught the snow schools. We had, this is pre-everything, we had a book, an actual physical book where you could write down who you were and the kind of climbing you wanted to do. And you could circulate it, and have your number. People could find partners that way. It was hard to find partners. Yeah, so there were 4. Was that it? The yodel, the instructional, speaker series, and the book. And those were the 4 things that we did. And that was really just a function of my desire to not die and to connect with other folks in this place and go climbing. So that was round 1. And then Yvon threw my name in the hat to edit the American Alpine Journal once I came up with my first issue of the Mountain Yodel. That was my first real job. I did that for around 6 years. I had to go down to Golden, Colorado for that. That led to Alpinist magazine, and that fell into my lap. I mean, there's a whole story there. Then that led to, I think after that, I put together the Teton Boulder Project. And again, some of this is just selfish. There's no climbing in Jackson, Wyoming. That's one of the biggest challenges. And by that, I mean no cragging, nothing really accessible. So we decided to make our own, and that was with a boulder park that would pay tribute to the history of this place, pay tribute to those we've lost in the mountains. So that sits at the base of Snow King Mountain, and it's just a kick in the pants all summer long. I mean, it's just a great gathering spot. And I put together something called the Town Pump Bouldering Series, because that way we'd actually have one night all summer long per week when we could gather and just drink beer and go bouldering with our friends. So that's been going on for 8 or 9 years now. And I think, no matter what I've done, that's kind of been the motivation. There's always a selfish element, I think, to just about whatever we do. But there's also this motivating urge to convene folks and gather people up and celebrate what we love. I think my problem is I'm kind of like a Labrador retriever, and the ball goes bouncing by and I get really excited and I go to chase it. And every 6 to 8 years, whatever I'm doing starts to lose I get bored, and then I go and do something else. That's a habit pattern I'd like to try to break.
Habit patterns is something I want to come back to. If you had an inclination towards money, man, you would be successful because you just build and build. So along those lines, one of your newest project is a book/podcast project, the 90-Pound Rucksack, which I thoroughly enjoy. Honestly, it's the best listen that I get. Formerly monthly, now it's kind of stretched out to every few months. It's basically hardcore history for the outdoor enthusiast who is particularly inclined to alpine climbing. It's great. It's about the history of the 10th Mountain Division. I'll let you talk all about it, but really well put together. I mean, the storytelling, the cast of characters, the level of detail you go into, it's just gripping. And I've heard that from quite a few people. So thank you very much for undertaking this endeavor. But it's an entirely different medium for you. And I guess I'm curious, how has been working on a podcast changed your approach to how you would normally work with a story?
It's always been trying to put together narratives. The Boulder Park was putting a narrative around the legacy of climbing in this place and making it dynamic so kids could plug in. The whole idea of the Boulder Park is you go, you get pumped, and then there's a wall. We call it the the history of significant ascents in the Tetons. So it's all laser cut out of steel, and it's a timeline of significant climbing in the range that people can read when they're pumped. And then we put together a stone circle, and these slabs of granite are up to 12 feet high, and it riffs off the enclosure, which is this Vision Quest circle atop the Grand Tetons' only satellite peak, subsidiary summit. That's a tribute to the people that we've lost in the mountains. So that's that was an attempt to create a cohesive narrative of around three elements that are so key to climbing here, very specifically here, but I think anywhere, which is the climbing itself, the legacy that you're stepping into when you're climbing in a place, and that fact that it's dangerous and we lose people. And the loss of those people shapes who we are as a community, and it shapes our approach to the mountains. That was an example of a narrative approach to something that one might not necessarily see as a narrative type vehicle, like a public park as a narrative structure. That's might not be how most people think of public parks. With various publications like the Mountain Yodel or American Alpine Journal or Alpinist, that too was this attempt to create a cohesive storyline with each issue or each edition where possible. Because I think that what people respond to is not a scattershot of ideas or stories or significant ascents. If you can find the through line, if you can find that thread that creates the integral story, it becomes much more compelling. That was the approach that we took with the Alpinist Film Festival, with Alpin Film, and I think with 90-Pound Rucksack, it's sort of a variation on a theme. It's how do you create a cohesive story using a medium of storytelling that connects with people where they're at. And what I'm trying to do is really find those human elements that make a story come alive. For me, what really pops about this incredible unit of folks that came out of World War II are the individual stories behind it.
So we've talked a lot about narrative and in different projects and facets, and it's really interesting actually to hear about the bouldering project and the story of climbers in the area and history. For you, I guess, like how do you identify narrative in these different elements and projects? Like what are the clues you look for and why do you hone in on that?
Well, I think I can't remember where I first came upon this, but the idea of how we affect people and really how we affect change is related to the bifurcation between the head and the heart. We get hit with facts and figures all day long. And, particularly in the current political discourse, they're not going to change how we see the world. And I think the one way that we actually reach people is through their hearts. And the best way to reach them in that space is with stories. For a story to be successful, it has to have elements within which they can see themselves.
You've talked a lot about how you pay attention or you're attuned to your heart and emotions. And I'm thinking about when you first got to the Teton range and just now is like resonance for stories. And it reminds me actually of, I just happened to come across the first issue of Alpinist when I was in a gear repair store in North Conway. And you had this awesome line by William Morris, is that correct? And more, I'm actually just going to read it just so I don't mess it up. The line is, have nothing in your houses that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. And I mean, that really strikes me as a beautiful, simplistic heuristic that can really help you, life principles. And I guess I wonder for you, like, have you been able to distill down some of these sort of guiding principles that direct where you put a time and energy and attention to? And does that quote resonate for you at all still?
Well, I feel like it's my guiding principle, and at the same time, it's forever aspirational. I try to make things as beautiful as I can, but that's the trick. If making things beautiful were easy, we'd have a world that's filled with a lot more beauty than it is. And if it were easy to make everything, useful, we wouldn't have all the waste that we've got out there. I think with all the projects that I do, I try to make them beautiful. And, that's really, you have to understand the eye of the beholder when you're trying to make something beautiful. If it's just beautiful to you, you might be the only person who thinks it's beautiful. And so you're trying to find things that are transcendent, that can transcend one person's perception of what's beautiful. And you try to touch on things that are universal. And it's really hard to do. If there's one element out there that I always try to lean into, it's what I feel every time I'm in the mountains, which is awe. I think with the story, with 90-Pound Rucksack, I am in awe. I've become increasingly awed by this, the contributions of the men who made the 10th Mountain Division what it was. I've become awed by this moment in time. It boggles my mind what the world was going through at that point. I have a really hard time wrapping my head around Hitler and how close the world got to succumbing to his evil vision. I've been awed by America's response to Hitler and to the Axis powers and the transformation the country went through in order to defeat them. Trying to translate my awe into something that's bigger than just my own perceptions, trying to translate it into something that touches on a universal sense of awe. It's aspirational. It's what I'm trying to do. I find it so difficult. Like I'm stuck here. I'm trying to work on this opening passage for this next episode, and I'm just really having a hard time teasing out those elements that are, what the Brits say are gobsmacking, like you're like, holy shit, are you serious? And use that to frame up, this episode's about the gear that was developed for the mountain troops. I find the whole writing process to be incredibly difficult. I'm having a hard time writing it, but that's what I'm trying to do is get inside that awe and open it up so that more people can be awed as well. Every time I'm in the mountains or in nature in general, and I've become an awe junkie. I've been going in for so long now. If you just take the Tetons, I've been going into the Tetons for 30 years. I've seen them in so many different times of day, so many different forms of light. I've seen them in the summer and the winter and the spring and the fall. It's funny. It almost becomes a little bit more difficult to get awed, which I'm kind of currently very curious about that. But that sense of awe is something that is universal. So there's something called biophilic language patterns, and these are simply principles of evolution that have been determined to evoke similar responses across all generations, across all nationalities, all ethnicities. And there are 14 pattern languages in biophilic design. Awe is that sense of vastness that the human mind has trouble comprehending. It is present in everywhere in the world, in all people of all ages, all ethnicities, all races. It is the motivating principle of my life in some ways. It's why I love to be outside. And so trying to tap into the awe that I feel exists organically and authentically in the story and frame it up as such in a way that can awe people that are listening to it. That's the aspirational goal. Whether or not I'm able to do it, I'm not sure, but that's what I'm trying to do with the story.
Were you always inclined towards that sort of larger sense or larger ideals? I guess that's a question. The second part of it was then I guess like how have you developed that over time as well? Because it doesn't strike me as something that necessarily comes natural. I mean, imagine if maybe you're very empathetic, you would always sort of be thinking about how to be, welcome the other into your story or your project. But Yeah, I guess I just think about like my own writing. I did a lot of reading and research and evaluating other people's works to try to figure out like how they find that gobsmacking thing and how they don't bury the lead, and how you build that story. But
Yeah.
it's another thing entirely to really try to suss out the universal human element. And I kind of got to a point where I was like, maybe not all stories need to have that, but the good ones do for sure.
When I was 8 years old, there was a fellow who came. My dad used to pull anybody he could into working on the farm. And my dad shanghaied this one fellow in, Bill Sheelion. And over the course of a summer, he read me The Hobbit. And that blew my mind. That story transported me in a way that almost nothing has since. I just wanted to inhabit that land of dragons and wizards and adventures. It was awesome. From then on, whenever I was in the fields, I was off in a fantasy land. I made a horrible farmer because I just would rather be somewhere in Middle Earth. And I think I've always been trying to find my way to Middle Earth, where everything was very clearly delineated between good and evil. It was a time that was larger than the life that we know here. But then I look at World War II and I'm like, huh, because that was the inspiration for Tolkien and his work. And it was that time of black and white. And of course, nothing is black and white. But for the purposes of storytelling, and I feel like we do understand the world in terms of stories, it was one of the last times when things were black and white for us. And as I've gotten deeper and deeper into this, perhaps those are my blinders, and perhaps that's the narrative vehicle I'm using to tell this story. But I think it is somewhat authentic to couch it in those terms. And the more I'm learning about the lead up to the war, the more I'm realizing that if there ever was a pure evil, it's Hitler. We were going to be speaking German. If it hadn't been for Churchill, and if it hadn't been for President Roosevelt, and if it hadn't been for Japan bombing Pearl Harbor, frankly, because the isolationist movement in the country was so strong, we might not have the world that we know today. More than anything else, it's an awesome story. And that's what I'm trying to do, is just tease out that awe for others to be able to step into. And you want to do it in a way that they don't realize that they don't see the effort behind it. You never want them to be focused on whoever's telling the story. You want them to be focused on the story itself. So if you can disappear as a storyteller and allow the story to emerge as that narrative vehicle that transports them to wherever it is you want them to go, that's what I'm trying to do.
I do just want to make a declarative statement that you are, contrary to what you said earlier, a very good writer, and I've been thoroughly enjoying the podcast.
That's kind of you.
No, I mean, it's awesome. It's been great work. It's been a joy to listen to for the hour and a half. I think sometimes even 2 hours.
Tell me about it.
I'm curious, like what the process, because you keep going deeper and deeper. You keep layering upon layering, and you keep uncovering different tendrils that you pursue. And basically, the question is like the mechanics of how this actually all works. Like, do you mind maybe peeling back some of the mystery of it? Like, how do you go about finding the sources and material, and then how are you documenting and sorting it, and how do you make sense of it all?
I think my challenge is I've never met a simple problem I haven't been able to complicate. It would be nice to think that this would be a relatively easy story to tell, because there are already a number of civilian as well as military histories of it. But I also go into this, I came in sideways or backward or something like that. I began by reading the American Alpine Journal's version of the 10th Mountain Division, and that was told from the climber's perspective. And then I began reading the civilian versions of the story, and they kept talking about all the skiers, and they didn't really talk about the climbers. And I just read this whole, there was a 1946 war edition of the American Alpine Journal was completely dedicated to the 10th Mountain Division as told from the perspective of the climbers. And so I'm reading these civilian histories, it's just a completely different story. And one thing I'm very conscious of is, history is a function of those who tell it. Certain people recognize that, and they recognize the importance of controlling the narrative if they want their version of history to be out there. So I assume a human element at play in all of this. And when I'm looking at the story of the 10th Mountain Division, there's a fellow named Minnie Dole, and he was the co-founder and the first director of the National Ski Patrol System. I found letters that he wrote to Bob Bates, the American climber who I knew, back in the day, part of the Harvard Five, part of the American Alpine Club. Minnie Dole wrote his story, Adventures in Skiing, as he was recovering from cancer. He was quite aware of his own mortality, and I think he was quite aware of, well, I don't know how aware he was of his need to secure his place in history. But I think that was a motivation, and that colored his telling of the story. And in his telling of the story, he's kind of it. He's the locomotive and caboose and train tracks of the 10th Mountain Division. And I know that's not true. So I'm trying to dive in, and I'm trying to figure out the story in part by employing a healthy degree of skepticism to whatever it is I'm reading. I've found plenty of errors in Bob Bates' recollections of how it all came together. I just think this is human tendency. Like, he was talking about how, so in 1939, he and Ad Carter, who was my predecessor at the American Alpine Journal, they're in Switzerland, they're climbing, they observe the maneuvers of the Swiss mountain troops, and they say, hey, maybe we should start thinking about that. And they go home and they're uber connected, because anybody climbing in Europe in 1939 at the end of the Depression has cash and has the latitude to take a summer off and go over there. Everybody's gone to Harvard, and they're all, the network is a bunch of blue-blooded aristocrats, et cetera, et cetera. And so in his papers in the Denver Public Library, Bob, he writes something about Ad going and talking to Henry Stimson. And he said it was like either early or late 1940. And I'm like, oh my God, Bob. I mean, number one, that makes all the difference in the world, because Minnie Dole's efforts didn't really kick in until the summer of 1940. And if Ad went to see Henry Stimson in early 1940, Henry Stimson was Secretary of War under President Taft, Secretary of State under President Hoover, and then became Secretary of War under Roosevelt in June of 1940. He was also a climber who had been a member of the American Alpine Club. So if anybody got the need for competency in moving effectively and efficiently over mountain terrain, it'd be Henry Stimson. So if Ad went to see him in early 1940, then that would be an incredible missing link in this whole narrative. I have pored over the files of H. Adams Carter and Bob Bates. I've tried to look through Henry Stimson's files. I haven't really gotten theirs as much as I'd like. I've pored over the American Alpine Club board meeting minutes, and I do not think that H. Adams Carter ever connected with Henry Stimson directly. And so, even with Bob, who, I love him. I found him to be an incredible gentleman and incredibly humble. I think that the stories we tell ourselves become our own versions of history, but they have a human element at play. And I feel like a healthy degree of skepticism of any telling of the story, regardless of who's telling it, allows you to parse out what we know to be true from that which might have been influenced by all these human considerations that are just the idiosyncrasies that make us up as people. Every book I read, every article I read, every person I talk to, I have a degree of skepticism that what I am hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But that just, which is why it's taken me so damn long to read this, because I'm trying to cross-check every single thing I can. And, case in point, so there's this paper, and I've just been looking at it, and it's by Dick Wilson, and it's on all the businesses that were started by 10th Mountain Division veterans after the war. It's completely focused on the skiing. And I'm like, well, where the hell's everything else? And so I'm here in the Tetons. I've studied the people who are from the Tetons who went into the 10th. I've studied the people who have come from the 10th into the Tetons. And I know John Montaigne helped start what's now the Jenny Lake Rangers. That's the Alpine Rescue Force in America today. I know that Dick Emerson was hired by Grand Teton National Park specifically for his climbing expertise. He was the first person ever hired by the National Park Service specifically for his climbing expertise. I know that Doug McLaren and Ernie Field, together with Dick Emerson and John Montaigne, helped stand up the Grand Teton Mountain Rescue Team, which then became the Jenny Lake Rangers. None of those folks are even mentioned in Dick Wilson's paper. John Montaigne is mentioned, but only in terms of his skiing. He was one of the founders of avalanche science as we know it today. So I look at Dick Wilson's paper and I'm looking for what's missing, because he's got all the ski areas that the 10th Mountain Division either founded or developed. And he's got the, 2,000 10th Mountain Division veterans who became ski instructors after the war. But he's not talking at all about contributions outside of skiing. And my whole point is that these guys came back and they had this profound impact on what we understand to be outdoor recreation today. But a lot of pieces of that story are simply missing. And so you got to keep digging and keep digging and keep digging and keep digging.
I mean, maybe you haven't gotten to the bottom of that discrepancy yet, or maybe you're saving that for a later episode. But do you have a sense of where that supreme lack of coverage comes from the citizen eye view of the 10th Mountain Division comes from? Or basically, like where the lack of proper kudos to climbers comes into play. I mean, you've talked about like an egocentricity element of it for Minnie Dole, and maybe those are my words, maybe more than yours, but I imagine it's not just like a blasé, like ignorance and forgetfulness. Like, was it a competition thing, self-preservation? Do you have an idea of where that comes from?
I've got this advisory board that's phenomenal. They're the foremost experts on the 10th Mountain Division. And we just start these conversations, 2 or 3 times a week. We have conversations like this. And the latest one is on exactly this: why the focus on the skiing to the omission of everything else. Part of it's simply it's a function of numbers. There were 1 to 2 million skiers in the country before the war, and there were 12,000 members of the various mountaineering organizations, and there were between 500 and 1,000 climbers who understood how to climb technical routes. The numbers were just hugely biased towards skiing. So that is a function of it. The other thing we've been talking about is there a ski bias? Because the stories that got picked up in the press starting in 1941, there was an article in the New Yorker magazine, and it was entitled "Minnie's Ski Troops." And there was a cover article in Life magazine, the most popular magazine in the country at the time, and it said on it, "Ski Troopers, U.S. Ski Troopers." The whole concept of the mountain unit became synonymous with skiing. And post-war, the 10th Mountain Division they went back out into America, and they gravitated toward skiing because they learned how to ski in the mountains. One of the things that I'm beginning to believe is that there was this sort of confirmation bias. Everybody was looking for skiing all the time. There was a preponderance of skiers in the unit because there were a preponderance of skiers in America. There just weren't a lot of climbers. Climbing was hard work and it could kill you. So there's, the number of people that wanted to take that up were somewhat limited. And so as a result, we've got this narrative that is focused so much on the skiing element. It was all skiers. They went out into the country after the war and they started skiing and da-da-da-da. Yeah, it's a function of numbers. It's I think a function of confirmation bias, but I know that's not all of the story. And so I'm trying to tease out that element of the story as well. And at the same time, I'm conscious of my own bias. And because I've been skiing since I was 5 years old, and trust me, I ski a hell of a lot more than I do climb these days because, it's dumping right now. We got 46 inches over the last 4 days, and we got another 2 feet starting here. You have to ski in Jackson,
Damn.
Wyoming
Yeah,
because
wow.
it's the winters last forever. And they're just so rugged. But I identify as a climber. And so I'm trying to confirm my own bias in here that the climbers were under-recognized and underappreciated. At the same time, I want to be conscious of that bias and give skiing the credit it is due too, because it was a huge motivator. It was a huge factor in the development of the unit. And it really did play out after the war in the ski industry. I mean, you've just got so many ski areas around the country that the 10th Mountain Division veterans came home. They're all fucked up. They want to fan back out in these places that they fell in love with when they were training either at Fort Lewis or Camp Hale. And so they go to the mountain towns. And a lot of times they go skiing. And that is true. That's absolutely true. They were the impetus for the explosion in skiing that had already begun before the war. In the 5 years before the war, there had been an explosion. Everything was in place for an explosion at the time we went to war, for an explosion in skiing. It absolutely was. But when they came back, everything aligned. You had all the gear that had been developed for them was suddenly Army surplus. You had an economic boom. So suddenly people had more money and they could buy stuff for pennies on the dollar. You had just this desire to be back out in these places that had felt so good while they were training. I've done a lot of research on the mental health benefits of time outside. And the one part to me that is fascinating that I just haven't seen very much about is the reason that they were going back into these places was not only because it had felt good when they were training, but what we know now is that nature heals, that time outside it has mental health benefits that help with suicide ideation, for example. When these guys are coming back, they were shell shocked. And that is something that we know as PTSD now. And I believe that they were going back there because it was either that or the bottle. How many ways do you have to stave off those demons, that trauma? And you can drink. That's one very common way, but you can also be outside.
The sort of culmination of the 10th Mountain Division, this sort of epitome of what they were training for, was to capture a German stronghold on Riva Ridge. And you went there this summer. You're a climber, so you probably wanted some on the ground research, and so you climbed it. What was that like?
It was eye-opening. I went in thinking, so I live in Jackson. So, kind of right behind my left shoulder is a mountain called Snow King. It's around 1,500 feet vert, from the valley floor up to the top. And Riva Ridge ranged from 1,500 to 2,500 feet. It was around 7 miles long. Its western flanks are gentle enough that the Germans were able to resupply using vehicles. The eastern wall, the eastern aspect of this escarpment was precipitous enough that the Germans basically didn't guard it because they thought it impossible for a company of soldiers to climb, particularly in winter. And so I've studied it. It's heavily wooded. I think it averages between 32 to maybe 45, maybe 50 degrees in places, which is about like Snow King. And I go up Snow King, I go up 100 times a year. I mean, it's like it's where we play, and I can do it in an hour, and it's my lunch break. And so I thought it'd be like that, a little tedious. You got to navigate trees and it's steep, so you're slipping around. But I thought it basically wouldn't be that difficult. And so I went up the route that John McCown had reconnoitered. It's Route 3. It was the most difficult line on the escarpment. It had actually defied the abilities of the 10th Mountain Division to figure out. They reconnoitered the other 4 routes beginning in the middle of January, but they couldn't figure this one route out that went right up the middle of the face because it wasn't a combat problem. It was essentially a mountaineering problem. And so I wanted to figure out what that was like. I'm sitting here in the middle of summer, sweating my ass off, trying to imagine what it'd be like in winter at night without light with a company of 270 men. I went up the first few sandstone bands and they're relatively straightforward. But then I hit this one band and it ran across most of the face. Like I couldn't figure out how I would get over one side or the other to find a break. And I eventually traversed, and it was like overhanging and probably 25, 30 feet high. Eventually, I was able to contour right, and it was really steep, and there was a drop off below, like steep enough where I didn't want to slip because I would have bingled. I would have just ass over tea kettle down the thing. And I finally found this one break where it was kind of like dirt going up into the sandstone, and there was a tree, and there were these rotten roots that were protruding from the dirt. It was overhanging. And so I started up and I got a wife and a kid down below. And yeah, I didn't want to bingle. And so I got up part way up, and I just remember I got, my arm around one of these dead roots that's protruding from the dirt. And suddenly I started feeling all the stinging on my face and in my eyeballs. And I was getting attacked by red ants. And so I quickly tried to back down off of that. And then, I got all the ants off, and I'm looking up. I'm like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. I should not be doing this. But at the same time, I was like, okay, well, I have to do this because John did it. And so eventually I went back up, and it was fucking desperate. It was, 5'6" overhanging dirt, climbing, grabbing rotten branches, stupid. There's no way I should have been doing it. I got up and I was just like, oh my God. I mean, the fact that he got 270 people up it at night in winter without lights boggled my mind. I've become more conscious of how difficult the job of training a unit of people, and in 15,000 people who are capable of doing something like this, that is, it's an enormous undertaking. I just came away from the entire experience with so much more respect for what they did. Ironically enough, the 10th itself was over there as well, just before me, and they went up one of the easier routes on the right. And General Anderson, the commanding general of the division, along with Command Sergeant Major Mobar, the second in command, I've been talking to them about it, and I was like, do you guys think you could the 10th today get up Riva Ridge under similar circumstances? And they hedged their bets, but basically they said not the way those guys did. It's just too difficult. So I just came away from that whole experience with a level of understanding that deepened my appreciation for what they did. It really did. But I mean, that's what I love to do. Like we just pulled off this thing called the 90-Pound Rucksack Challenge where, it's on the anniversary of the ascent of Riva Ridge. I carried 80 pounds up Mount Glory, which is right here in the Tetons. And every step of the way, I was thinking to myself, oh my God, these guys regularly trained with 90 pounds on their backs. There was something called the D series, a divisional series that began in March of 1944, went on for 3 weeks, temps down to 30 below, 8 feet of snow. They had to take 14,000 foot summits and hold them against counterattacks with 90 pounds on their backs. I think until you actually go out and try to do some of this stuff, you can't appreciate the enormity of the challenges that they were able to overcome.
The last thing before we part is there anything that the listeners can do for you or for 90-Pound Rucksack? And of course, everyone should go check it out because it is an awesome, a masterpiece in storytelling and uncovering history and spinning narrative. Is there anything that you'd like to leave the listeners with?
Well, and I really appreciate how deep you've gone into these questions. It hasn't just been a series of rote questions looking for a series of rote answers. And I love the complications of life, obviously. I love the complications of the story, and I love the effort that you've taken to get inside the complications of it. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk. I'd love if people are interested in this story and they want to check it out, they can do so wherever you get podcasts or at christianbeckwith.com. This is going to be news to everyone, but podcasting is not particularly lucrative, and I do have a mortgage. And so if folks are so inclined and they want to support this kind of journalism, they could become a patron. So we've got a really strong community of patrons right now, but we need it to be stronger to keep telling this story. And so if people become patrons, we create a lot of additional interviews. We just posted that video on Riva Ridge that took a lot of time to put together. It's specifically for our patron community, but becoming a patron is the single best thing you can do to support the story.
And you all should, because we want more of this.
Fingers crossed. We'll keep it going.
To listen to 90-Pound Rucksack, head to your favorite podcast platform or learn more about it at christianbeckwith.com. If you love what Christian is doing and want to support long-form narrative projects like this, I highly encourage you to become a patron at patreon.com/90-pound rucksack. And while you're there, consider supporting us as well. You can find us at patreon.com/ice-beta. And with that, if you can believe it, season 1 is in the books. Thank you to all of our guests, and I'm going to name all of them, so stay tuned. Patrick, Marianne, Eli, Anju, Aki, Ryan, Stas, Matthias, Kelsey, Doug, Deed, Ben and Nick, Benjamin, Kyle, Marty, Liz, Tom, Shane, Kendra, Taylor, John, Willis and Oz, John, Melissa, Bill, Jackson, and Christian. Thank you very much for being a part of this. And thank you also to our patrons. I won't name you all, but you've made this podcast possible. So truly, thank you very much. And lastly, thanks to all you listeners out there. Really appreciate you spending time with us each week. And that's it. We'll pick things up again in May. Stay tuned. Ciao.